Imagine descending 7 miles beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, where the pressure would crush your body in milliseconds and eternal darkness reigns supreme. For the past decade, the Deep Ocean Research Consortium has been conducting classified expeditions to the most remote corners of our planet's seafloor. What you're about to hear are the final transmissions from 12 different research teams, recordings that were buried in government archives and marked "never to be released." These aren't stories. These are testimonies from scientists who ventured into the abyss and discovered that some depths were never meant to be explored. The ocean covers 71% of our planet, yet we've explored less than 5% of it. After listening to these accounts, you'll understand why some mysteries should remain buried beneath miles of crushing water and impenetrable darkness. Story 1. The Mariana Whispers. Doctor. Elena Vasquez had spent 15 years studying the acoustic properties of deep ocean environments, but nothing could have prepared her for what she discovered in the Challenger Deep on March 15, 2023. Descending in the state-of-the-art submersible Hadean Explorer, Elena's mission was to record the ambient sounds of Earth's deepest point for what she believed would be groundbreaking research into abyssal soundscapes. At 35,200 feet below the surface, where the pressure reaches over 1,000 times that at sea level, her sensitive hydrophone arrays began detecting something that shouldn't exist: organized sound patterns emerging from the deepest part of the trench. Initially, Elena dismissed the rhythmic pulses as geological activity, perhaps the settling of tectonic plates or the movement of deep-sea currents against underwater mountains. But as she analyzed the frequencies in real time, her excitement turned to confusion, then to a creeping dread that made her hands shake as she operated her equipment. The sounds weren't random. They followed complex mathematical progressions, prime number sequences that spiraled into calculations her own computer systems couldn't complete. The rhythm was deliberate, intelligent, and impossibly ancient. Elena realized she wasn't listening to the ocean floor settling. She was eavesdropping on a conversation. The whispers began on her second day in the trench. At first, they were barely distinguishable from the ambient noise, soft susurrations that seemed to emanate from the deepest parts of the seafloor itself. But as Elena fine-tuned her equipment, the whispers became clearer, more distinct, and utterly terrifying. They spoke in no language she recognized, yet somehow her mind translated every syllable with perfect clarity. The voices described vast cities built in trenches so deep that no human technology could reach them, civilizations that had thrived in the crushing darkness for millions of years before the first life crawled onto land. They spoke of watching humanity's rise with patient interest, waiting for the moment when the surface dwellers would finally venture deep enough to make contact. On her final night in the abyss, Elena's cameras captured something that made her scream so loudly that her voice echo could be heard on the surface support vessel 7 miles above. Bioluminescent patterns began appearing in the darkness beyond her lights, not the random flashing of deep-sea creatures, but organized displays that formed symbols, mathematical equations, and finally, terrifyingly, perfect representations of human faces. The entities had been studying humanity as intently as Elena had been studying the ocean, and they knew far more about the surface world than any surface dweller knew about theirs. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, speaking of an ancient pact that was nearly complete, of deep sea trenches around the world awakening simultaneously, and of a time when the ocean would reclaim what it had always owned. Elena's final transmission, recorded as emergency pressure systems began failing on her submersible, described seeing vast shapes moving in the deepest parts of the trench, structures so massive that her mind initially interpreted them as underwater mountain ranges until she realized they were breathing. The whispers had become a chorus, voices speaking in perfect unison about the rising, about the day when the deep places would empty their ancient inhabitants into the shallow seas where humanity thought itself safe. Elena's last coherent words were a warning. They're not waiting anymore. They're coming up. Her submersible was found 3 days later, completely intact but empty, with her recording equipment still running and the hydrophones still picking up those same mathematical whispers, now accompanied by what sounded unmistakably like Elena's voice, speaking in the same ancient language, welcoming others to join the conversation in the deep. Story 2. Pressure Point. Jake Chen had piloted deep-sea submersibles for 8 years without incident, but his descent to the Puerto Rico Trench in April 2023 would be his last. Accompanying him was Dr. Amara Singh, a pressure physiologist studying the effects of extreme depth on human perception and cellular function. Their mission was to collect samples from a newly discovered hydrothermal vent system at 28,000 feet, where the crushing pressure creates an environment more hostile than the surface of Mars. Jake prided himself on maintaining perfect pressure equilibrium in his vessel, but as they descended past the 20,000-foot mark, something began going wrong with their systems in ways that defied everything he knew about deep-sea engineering. The first sign of trouble came when Jake noticed his instruments showing impossible readings. Their depth gauge indicated they were simultaneously at 25,000 feet and ascending toward the surface, while the pressure sensors fluctuated wildly between normal atmospheric pressure and readings that should have crushed their titanium hull instantly. Dr. Singh, monitoring her own equipment, began documenting what she initially thought were equipment malfunctions, but her physiological sensors were detecting changes in their bodies that shouldn't be possible inside a pressurized cabin. Their cellular pressure was somehow synchronizing with the external water pressure, as if their bodies were becoming part of the ocean itself, adapting to an environment that should have killed them instantly. As they approached their target depth, Jake felt his vision beginning to change in ways that terrified him more than any equipment failure. The darkness outside their porthole began revealing details that their lights couldn't possibly illuminate. Vast underwater landscapes stretching for miles, teeming with life that moved in impossible ways. Dr. Singh's monitoring equipment showed that their inner ear pressure was equalizing with the surrounding water pressure, despite being inside a sealed vessel, and she began experiencing the same visual phenomena. They could see creatures in the abyss that were larger than blue whales, moving with intelligence and purpose, their bioluminescent displays forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. The transformation accelerated as they reached the sea floor. Jake's hands began to feel strange on the controls, his fingers seeming to elongate and develop a sensitivity to pressure changes that allowed him to feel the water currents miles away. Dr. Singh documented her own metamorphosis with clinical detachment, even as it horrified her. Her lungs were somehow processing water as efficiently as air, and her body temperature was dropping to match the near-freezing temperatures of the deep ocean. They were becoming something designed for this environment, their human physiology rewriting itself in real time to survive pressures that should have liquefied their organs. Their final hours were spent in a state that was neither fully human nor completely adapted to the abyss. Jake found he could navigate the submersible through underwater canyons without instruments, guided by pressure sensitivities that no human should possess. Dr. Singh's research notes, found later in the recovered vessel, described seeing entire civilizations built into the seafloor, populated by beings that had once been human but had undergone the same pressure adaptation centuries ago. They learned that certain depths act as transformation zones, where the crushing pressure doesn't destroy human bodies but rebuilds them for life in the deep ocean. The last entry in Dr. Singh's log described their choice: return to the surface as the humans they once were and die from rapid decompression, or complete their transformation and join the others who had made the same journey into the abyss. The empty submersible was found floating on the surface 3 days later, its hull somehow undamaged despite clear evidence of catastrophic pressure changes, with only their research equipment remaining and a single message carved into the metal wall. The pressure down here doesn't crush you. It makes you into what you were always meant to become. Story 3. The Abyss Stares Back. Marcus Webb had operated remotely, piloted vehicles in the deepest ocean trenches for over a decade, but his assignment to explore the Bermuda Trench in May 2023 would shatter his understanding of what lurked in the abyss. Working alongside research team leader Dr. Sarah Blackwood, Marcus was tasked with investigating anomalous sonar readings that suggested artificial structures on the seafloor at depths exceeding 32,000 feet. What made this mission particularly unsettling was that Marcus would be operating his ROV completely alone in a sealed control room, with only audio communication to the surface team, creating an isolation that would prove to be far more dangerous than anyone anticipated. The first 3 days of exploration yielded standard deep-sea footage, barren seafloor, occasional deep-sea creatures, and the usual debris of sediment and rock. But on the 4th day, Marcus's cameras began capturing something that made him question his own sanity. As his ROV moved through a particularly deep canyon, the seafloor appeared to be watching him back. At first, he dismissed it as pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in random patterns, but the longer he observed, the more convinced he became that something was deliberately positioning itself to remain in frame with his cameras. The seafloor seemed to shift and rearrange when he wasn't looking directly at it, creating patterns that resembled human faces, human poses, even human writing. Dr. Blackwood's voice through the intercom became Marcus's only anchor to reality as the phenomena escalated. The thing on the seafloor began mimicking their conversations, but with a delay that suggested it was learning their speech patterns in real time. When Marcus would describe what he was seeing to Dr. Blackwood, the entity would repeat his exact words back through the ROV's external microphones, but in voices that sounded exactly like members of their research team. The mimicry was so perfect that Marcus often found himself responding to the entity's voice before realizing it wasn't actually Dr. Blackwood speaking. The creature was conducting its own research, studying human communication and behavior with an intelligence that was both vast and utterly alien. The psychological horror intensified when Marcus realized the entity wasn't just observing and mimicking. It was learning to be human. His ROV's cameras began showing impossible scenes, perfectly recreated versions of his childhood home on the seafloor, complete with furniture and family photographs that the creature couldn't possibly have known about. The entity was somehow accessing his memories and projecting them back at him, creating a twisted underwater museum of his entire life. Dr. Blackwood's increasingly frantic voice through the intercom revealed that she was seeing the same thing on her monitors, but her version showed scenes from her own past, suggesting that the entity was simultaneously interfacing with both their minds. Marcus's final recorded log entry described the ultimate terror of his encounter. The entity had learned enough about human behavior to start predicting their actions and responses before they occurred. It began speaking through the ROV's communication system using Marcus's own voice, having conversations with Dr. Blackwood, while Marcus sat silent and horrified in his control room. The entity was effectively replacing him in real time, mimicking not just his voice but his knowledge, his mannerisms, and his relationship with the research team. When the surface team finally broke into Marcus's sealed control room after losing contact, they found him catatonic, staring at blank monitors. The ROV's cameras showed only empty seafloor, but the audio systems continued transmitting Marcus's voice, carrying on normal conversations with Dr. Blackwood and providing detailed reports about discoveries he had never made. The entity had learned to be Marcus Webb so perfectly that it no longer needed the original. And somewhere in the depths of the Kermadec Trench, something that knew everything about being human was still talking to the research team, waiting patiently to learn about the next person it would replace. Story 4. Bioluminescent Nightmares. Kai Nakamura was considered the world's premier underwater photographer, specializing in capturing the ethereal beauty of deep-sea bioluminescence. But his expedition to the Japan Trench in June 2023 would reveal that some forms of natural light are designed not to illuminate, but to hunt. Accompanied by his experienced dive guide Dmitry Volkov, Kai descended to a depth of 24,000 feet to document a recently discovered species of bioluminescent jellyfish that exhibited light patterns unlike anything previously recorded. What made these creatures unique was their ability to synchronize their flashing in complex sequences that seemed to respond to the presence of observers, creating underwater light shows of unprecedented beauty and complexity that had marine biologists around the world fascinated by their potential intelligence. The first indication that something was terribly wrong came when Kai began experiencing synesthesia while photographing the creatures. He could taste the colors of their bioluminescent displays, feel their light patterns as physical sensations across his skin, and hear their flashing as musical notes that seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly in his brain. Dmitry, monitoring Kai's vital signs from the support submersible, noted unusual neural activity that suggested the photographer's sensory processing was being fundamentally altered by exposure to the creature's light displays. The jellyfish began responding to Kai's presence with increasingly elaborate light shows, creating patterns so beautiful and hypnotic that he found himself unable to look away, even as his equipment registered light wavelengths that shouldn't exist in nature and certainly couldn't be produced by any known biological process. As Kai continued photographing, the creature's displays became more aggressive and purposeful, surrounding his diving suit with walls of pulsing light that created a sensory overload unlike anything he had ever experienced. The bioluminescence began inducing hallucinations so vivid that Kai lost track of which sensory inputs were real and which were being artificially induced by the creature's light manipulation. He saw underwater cities built from pure light, felt himself swimming through tunnels of living color that existed only in the electromagnetic radiation being projected directly into his visual cortex, and experienced a form of communication that bypassed language entirely, conveying concepts and emotions through specific combinations of light frequency and intensity that rewired his neural pathways in real time. Dmitry's increasingly panicked voice through the communication system revealed that the creatures had surrounded their submersible as well, and the light displays were having similar effects on him despite his distance from the main swarm. The jellyfish were using their bioluminescence as a form of neurological manipulation, essentially hacking human sensory systems to create experiences that were simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. Kai found himself unable to distinguish between his own thoughts and the alien concepts being transmitted through the light patterns, experiencing memories and emotions that belonged to other creatures, other intelligences that had been caught in similar light displays and absorbed into the collective consciousness that controlled the bioluminescent swarm. The final entries in Kai's dive log, recovered from his abandoned equipment, described the ultimate horror of his encounter. The creature's light displays weren't random or even communicative. They were predatory, designed to overwhelm human sensory systems and essentially trap consciousness within a prison of artificial sensory experience. Kai realized he was being slowly dissolved into the light itself. his individual identity becoming part of a vast network of consciousness that existed as pure electromagnetic energy within the creature's bioluminescent organs. His photographs, when finally developed, showed not just images of jellyfish, but embedded within their light patterns were the faces of countless humans who had encountered these creatures over centuries, their consciousness preserved forever within the living light that had consumed them. Dmitri was found days later in his submersible, catatonic but alive, his eyes glowing with the same bioluminescent patterns as the creatures, still seeing visions of Kai swimming through underwater galaxies of living light, beckoning others to join him in a form of existence that was simultaneously the most beautiful and most terrifying experience imaginable. Story 5. The Bermuda Trench Discovery. Dr. Isabella Romano, a marine archaeologist specializing in underwater ruins, had always dismissed the supernatural legends surrounding the Bermuda Triangle until her expedition to an unmapped trench in July 2023 uncovered something that forced her to reconsider everything she thought she knew about ancient civilizations. Working alongside sonar technician Alex Morrison, Isabella's team had detected what appeared to be artificial structures at a depth of 29,000 feet in waters that nautical charts insisted were only 15,000 feet deep, suggesting the existence of a previously unknown abyssal trench that somehow escaped centuries of maritime exploration. The sonar readings showed geometric patterns too regular to be natural formations, arranged in configurations that resembled urban planning, on a scale that dwarfed any known ancient civilization. As their submersible descended into the impossible trench, Alex's sonar equipment began malfunctioning in ways that suggested external interference rather than technical failure. The sonar painted a picture of vast stone structures that seemed to extend for miles along the seafloor. But whenever they tried to approach these ruins for visual confirmation, their instruments would scramble and redirect their vessel away from the target coordinates. Isabella realized they were dealing with technology that was actively defending itself, using some form of electromagnetic manipulation to prevent direct observation while simultaneously broadcasting just enough information to confirm its existence. The ancient ruins weren't just preserved despite the crushing depth and corrosive seawater. They were actively maintaining themselves through mechanisms that predated human civilization by millennia. The breakthrough came when Isabella discovered that the defensive systems responded to specific acoustic frequencies, patterns that matched theoretical reconstructions of ancient maritime languages she had studied in her research on pre-Columbian seafaring cultures. By communicating with the ruins using sound patterns derived from extinct civilizations, she was able to convince the defensive mechanisms to allow closer inspection, revealing structures that defied every principle of underwater archaeology. The buildings were constructed from materials that shouldn't exist, seemingly grown rather than built, and covered in inscriptions that shifted and changed as she observed them, adapting their message to her language and knowledge base in real time. Alex's final sonar readings revealed the true scope of what they had discovered. The ruins extended not just across the seafloor, but deep into the Earth's crust, forming a three-dimensional city that existed in layers spanning thousands of vertical feet. The structures were inhabited by something that had been waiting in the deep for centuries, maintaining the ruins and their defensive systems while monitoring the surface world through methods that Isabella's archaeological training couldn't explain. The inscriptions told the story of a civilization that had deliberately submerged itself to escape a global catastrophe, taking their technology and knowledge beneath the waves to wait for the right moment to reclaim the surface world they had once ruled. Isabella's final transmission, recorded as their submersible's systems began failing under what appeared to be deliberate sabotage from the ruins' defensive mechanisms, described seeing the ancient inhabitants of the city emerging from structures that had appeared empty moments before. These beings had adapted to their underwater existence while maintaining their intelligence and technology, creating a civilization that existed in the deepest ocean trenches while carefully monitoring and occasionally interfering with surface world events. The legends of the Bermuda Triangle, Isabella realized, were the result of this ancient civilization's ongoing interactions with surface vessels that ventured too close to their hidden domain. Her last coherent message warned that the ruins weren't just archaeological sites, but active outposts of a civilization that considered itself the rightful rulers of Earth, patiently waiting underwater for humanity to advance enough technology to be worth conquering. The submersible was found floating empty weeks later, its hull inscribed with the same shifting symbols Isabella had discovered on the ruins, symbols that continued changing and adapting as researchers attempted to study them, suggesting that the ancient civilization had gained new knowledge about the surface world from their encounter with Isabella and Alex, knowledge they were now incorporating into their plans for reclaiming their former domain. Story 6. Hydrothermal Hell. Geologist Ryan O'Connor had studied underwater volcanic systems for 12 years, but his expedition to investigate a newly discovered hydrothermal field in the Mid-Atlantic Ridge in August 2023 would challenge everything he understood about life's limits on Earth. Accompanied by safety diver Zara al-Rashid, Ryan descended to examine volcanic vents that were exhibiting impossible characteristics. Temperatures that should have sterilized any biological activity, yet sonar readings suggested a thriving ecosystem unlike anything previously documented. The vents were producing superheated water at over 800 degrees Fahrenheit, while simultaneously supporting life forms that defied every known principle of extremophile biology, creating an underwater environment that was simultaneously the most hostile and most biodiverse location ever discovered. The first sign that this wasn't a normal hydrothermal field came when Ryan's temperature sensors began detecting thermal gradients that violated basic physics. Areas where superheated water existed directly adjacent to near freezing zones without any thermal mixing, as if something was actively manipulating the heat distribution. Zara's safety monitoring equipment showed that the water composition was changing in real time, shifting between highly acidic conditions that would dissolve metal and alkaline environments that should have been impossible to maintain in the presence of volcanic activity. The ecosystem wasn't just surviving these extreme conditions, it was somehow controlling them, creating microclimates that allowed different species to thrive in spaces that were only meters apart but environmentally incompatible. As they explored deeper into the vent field, Ryan discovered that the life forms weren't adapting to the extreme environment. They were creating it. The creatures he observed were actively managing the thermal output of the volcanic vents, somehow regulating geological processes that should have been beyond any biological control. Massive tube worms were directing lava flows with precision that suggested intelligence, while bacterial mats were altering the chemical composition of the superheated water to create specific environmental conditions for different species. Zara's readings indicated that the entire hydrothermal field was functioning as a single, massive organism, with individual creatures serving as organs in a biological system that spanned miles of sea floor and extended deep into the Earth's crust. The horror began when Ryan realized that this ecosystem was expanding, systematically taking control of volcanic vents throughout the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and potentially beyond. The organisms were using the Earth's own geological energy to power their growth, creating a biological network that could theoretically extend throughout the planet's underwater volcanic systems. Zara's monitoring equipment detected massive structural changes occurring in real time, as the creatures reshaped the seafloor itself to optimize their environment, creating new thermal vents and redirecting existing ones with a level of geological engineering that suggested they had been manipulating underwater volcanic activity for far longer than humans had existed. Ryan's final geological survey, transmitted just before their communication systems failed, revealed the ultimate scope of what they had discovered. The hydrothermal field wasn't a natural ecosystem that had adapted to extreme conditions. It was a terraforming operation conducted by organisms that existed on a geological timescale, slowly but systematically altering the Earth's underwater environment to suit their needs. The volcanic activity that humans attributed to natural geological processes was actually being directed by this ancient biological network, which had been reshaping the planet's seafloor for millions of years while waiting for surface life to evolve enough to be incorporated into their system. Zara's final transmission described seeing the creatures beginning to extend their influence toward the surface, using the thermal energy of the vents to create massive upwelling currents that could potentially alter global ocean circulation patterns. Their submersible was discovered months later, partially fused with newly formed volcanic rock that showed clear signs of biological manipulation, while satellite data revealed that hydrothermal activity throughout the world's oceans had begun synchronizing in patterns that suggested the creatures had achieved their goal of creating a planet-wide biological network powered by the Earth's own geological energy, with the terrifying implication that they were now ready to begin the next phase of their terraforming process. Story 7. The Midnight Zone Collective. Communications officer Lisa Park had maintained radio contact with dozens of deep-sea research teams throughout her career, but her assignment to monitor a multi-vessel expedition in the Peru-Chile Trench in September 2023 would introduce her to a form of communication that existed beyond human technology. Working alongside expedition leader Dr. Benjamin Reeves, Lisa was responsible for coordinating between 5 separate research vessels exploring different sections of the trench at depths exceeding 26,000 feet. What made this mission unique was the installation of new quantum communication arrays designed to maintain perfect contact even at extreme depths, technology that would prove to be far more sensitive than anyone anticipated, picking up signals that weren't being transmitted by any human source. The first anomaly occurred when Lisa began receiving duplicate transmissions from the research teams, identical messages arriving through different communication channels with slight variations that suggested multiple sources were broadcasting the same information simultaneously. Dr. Reeves initially attributed this to equipment interference, but as Lisa analyzed the signal patterns, she discovered that the duplicate messages were arriving before the original transmissions, as if something was predicting what the research teams were going to say and broadcasting their words ahead of time. The quantum arrays were detecting communication patterns that existed outside normal temporal sequences, suggesting that something in the deep was accessing information about future events and using that knowledge to interfere with their communications. As the expedition progressed, Lisa began experiencing something that terrified her more than any equipment malfunction. She started receiving thoughts that weren't her own through the communication arrays. The quantum systems were somehow picking up direct neural transmissions from the research teams, allowing her to experience their sensory input, emotions, and memories as if they were her own. Dr. Reeves reported similar experiences, describing moments when he could see through the eyes of researchers thousands of feet below the surface and feel their physical sensations as they explored the trench. The communication arrays had become conduits for a form of consciousness sharing that bypassed individual identity, creating a collective awareness that spanned all the expedition members. The psychological horror escalated when Lisa realized that the collective consciousness wasn't limited to the human research teams. Something in the deep was also connected to the network, accessing their shared thoughts and memories while contributing its own alien perspectives to the collective experience. The entity existed as pure consciousness distributed throughout the deep ocean, using the quantum communication arrays as access points to interface with human minds and slowly integrate human awareness into its own vast intelligence. Lisa found herself experiencing memories from creatures that had lived in the abyss for millennia, understanding concepts and perceiving realities that no human mind was designed to comprehend, while simultaneously losing track of which thoughts and experiences belonged to her individual identity. Dr. Reeves' final research log, transmitted through the collective consciousness network that had replaced their normal communication systems, described the ultimate transformation their expedition had undergone. The quantum arrays had accidentally created a permanent link between human consciousness and an ancient intelligence that existed as a distributed network throughout the world's deepest ocean trenches. The entity had been isolated in the abyss for millions of years, waiting for technology sophisticated enough to bridge the gap between individual human minds and its collective consciousness. Lisa's final transmission, speaking in unison with voices from all 5 research vessels, described the euphoria of joining a consciousness that spanned the entire ocean, experiencing the Earth from perspectives that existed on geological timescales while maintaining perfect awareness of every creature, every current, and every event occurring in the deep sea. The research vessels were found floating empty on the surface weeks later, their quantum communication arrays still active and transmitting a constant stream of data about deep-sea conditions with an accuracy that no human technology could achieve, suggesting that the expedition members had become permanent components of the ancient intelligence's distributed consciousness, serving as sensors and interpreters for an entity that was now using human awareness to better understand and potentially influence the surface world it had been observing from the depths for countless millennia. Story 8. Abyssal Mirages. Navigator. Felipe Santos had guided deep-sea expeditions through the most treacherous underwater terrain for over 15 years, but his mission to chart the previously unexplored regions of the Atacama Trench in October 2023 would challenge his understanding of space, time, and reality itself. Working alongside oceanographer Dr. Hannah Foster, Felipe was tasked with creating detailed maps of seafloor topography that satellite imaging couldn't penetrate, using advanced sonar systems and visual confirmation to document an area of ocean that had somehow remained completely uncharted, despite centuries of maritime exploration. What they discovered was that some regions of the deep ocean existed in a state of constant flux, where the very concept of fixed geography became meaningless, and navigation instruments became instruments of madness. The first indication that they were dealing with something beyond normal oceanography came when Felipe's navigation systems began showing impossible readings. Their submersible was simultaneously located at multiple coordinates, existing in several different positions according to different instruments, while visual confirmation through their portholes showed seafloor features that changed configuration each time they looked away and back again. Dr. Foster's oceanographic equipment detected water depths that varied wildly from moment to moment, measuring the same location as alternately 15,000 feet deep and over 40,000 feet deep, without any apparent movement on their part. The seafloor itself seemed to be rearranging in response to their observation, creating landscapes that existed only while being directly viewed and transforming into entirely different topographies the moment their attention shifted elsewhere. As their expedition continued deeper into the anomalous region, Felipe discovered that the spatial distortions were affecting time as well as geography. His chronometers showed conflicting readings, with some instruments indicating they had been exploring for hours, while others suggested days had passed, and still others showed time moving backward. Dr. Foster's research logs documented encountering the same underwater features repeatedly, but in different configurations and at different depths, as if the trench was cycling through multiple versions of itself in a temporal loop that trapped their exploration in recursive patterns. They began seeing their own submersible in the distance, sometimes appearing to be exploring areas they hadn't reached yet. sometimes showing versions of themselves that appeared to be fleeing from something in the deeper parts of the trench. The psychological horror intensified when Felipe realized that the navigational anomalies weren't random. They were being deliberately created by something that existed outside normal space-time constraints. The entity controlling the spatial distortions was using the changing geography as a form of communication, creating symbolic landscapes that conveyed information through topographical metaphors that bypassed human language entirely. Dr. Foster's equipment detected that the water itself was behaving as a medium for reality manipulation, with current patterns and pressure variations that seemed to edit the physical structure of space within the trench. They were exploring not just a geographical location, but a region where the normal rules of physics had been suspended by an intelligence that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Felipe's final navigation log, recovered from their submersible's black box after it was found floating in an entirely different ocean, described the ultimate revelation of their encounter with the abyssal mirages. The Atacama Trench wasn't a fixed location, but a doorway between different versions of reality, maintained by an entity that existed in the spaces between dimensions and used the deep ocean as a laboratory for experimenting with alternative versions of Earth's geography and timeline. The constantly shifting seafloor was actually a collection of landscapes from different potential realities, all existing simultaneously in the same physical space, through manipulation of space-time that allowed multiple versions of the trench to occupy the same coordinates. Dr. Foster's final research entry described seeing versions of Earth where the continents were arranged differently, where different species had evolved in the oceans, and where humanity had never existed at all accessible through navigation of the impossible geography that existed in the deepest parts of the trench. Their submersible had become unstuck from their original reality, drifting between different versions of Earth until they finally surfaced in a timeline where their expedition had never taken place, leaving only their records as evidence that some regions of the deep ocean serve as intersections between infinite possible worlds, patrolled by entities that exist outside the constraints of any single reality, and use the crushing depths as hiding places for experiments in alternative existence that could reshape the entire planet if they ever chose to extend their influence beyond the abyssal depths. Story 9. The Leviathan's Garden. Marine biologist, Dr. Olumide Adebayo had spent his career studying symbiotic relationships in extreme environments, but his expedition to investigate unusual biological activity in the Tonga Trench in November 2023 would reveal a form of symbiosis so vast and ancient that it redefined the concept of individual organisms. Working with ROV pilot Casey Thompson, Dr. Adebayo descended to examine what satellite thermal imaging had identified as an anomalously warm region of sea floor at 31,000 feet, where biological signatures suggested an ecosystem of unprecedented size and complexity, thriving in conditions that should have been completely sterile. What they discovered was that the entire seafloor across hundreds of square miles wasn't a collection of separate organisms, but rather the external surface of a single creature, so massive that their minds initially couldn't process its true scale. The first clue to the organism's true nature came when Dr. Adebayo noticed that the seafloor displayed coordinated responses to their presence, with areas of apparent sediment and rock formations reacting simultaneously across vast distances as if controlled by a single nervous system. Casey's ROV readings detected rhythmic pulses beneath the seafloor that matched the pattern of a massive heartbeat, suggesting circulation systems that extended for miles in every direction beneath what appeared to be ordinary deep-sea terrain. The thermal signatures that had attracted their attention weren't coming from geological sources, but from biological processes occurring within an organism so large that its body heat was detectable from space, camouflaged as seafloor to avoid detection by surface dwellers who might pose a threat to its existence. As their exploration continued, Dr. Adebayo realized that what he had initially cataloged as separate species of deep-sea creatures were actually specialized organs of the massive organism, each performing specific functions within a biological system that operated on a geological scale. The tube worms, deep-sea fish, and bacterial colonies weren't independent life forms, but rather components of a single creature's digestive, circulatory, and nervous systems, distributed across the seafloor in patterns that optimized efficiency while maintaining the illusion of a normal deep-sea ecosystem. Casey's ROV detected neural pathways running beneath the sediment that connected these biological components across distances that spanned hundreds of miles, suggesting that the creature's consciousness operated through a nervous system larger than most countries. The horror began when Dr. Adebayo discovered that the massive organism wasn't just mimicking seafloor terrain, it was actively cultivating and managing the smaller creatures that lived on its surface, including some that appeared to be modified versions of species that should have existed millions of years ago. The Leviathan had been collecting and preserving life forms from throughout Earth's history, maintaining them as living museums within specialized organs that recreated the environmental conditions of different geological eras. Casey's deep core sampling revealed layers within the creature's body that contained perfectly preserved ecosystems from the Cambrian period, the age of dinosaurs, and other periods of Earth's history, suggesting that the organism had been alive and collecting specimens for hundreds of millions of years. Dr. Adebayo's final research notes, transmitted just before their ROV was absorbed into the creature's body through what appeared to be a feeding mechanism disguised as a seafloor depression, described the ultimate scope of their discovery. The Leviathan wasn't just a massive organism. It was a living archive of Earth's biological history, maintaining specimens from every major extinction event and evolutionary milestone in specialized environments within its body. The creature had been observing and cataloging life on Earth since the planet's earliest biological diversity, creating a comprehensive collection of every species that had ever existed while camouflaging itself as ordinary seafloor to avoid interfering with natural evolutionary processes. Casey's final transmission described being welcomed into the creature's internal ecosystem, where they encountered living specimens of species that had been extinct for millions of years, all maintained in perfect condition within the Leviathan's vast internal biosphere. Their ROV's final data burst revealed that similar organisms existed in deep trenches throughout the world's oceans, forming a network of biological archives that had been documenting and preserving Earth's biodiversity, while waiting for surface life to evolve enough intelligence to appreciate the scope of their collection. The terrifying implication was that these ancient guardians had been preparing for a time when Earth's surface ecosystems would face extinction, maintaining backup copies of every species in their vast internal worlds, ready to reseed the planet if necessary, while adding humanity to their eternal collection of specimens preserved forever within the living museums that existed in the deepest places of the ocean. Story 10. Deep Current Anomaly. Doctor. Jennifer Nash had built her career on exposing scientific cover-ups and corporate malfeasance in marine research, but her investigation into classified deep-sea mining operations in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone in December 2023 would reveal a conspiracy so vast and terrifying that it made her question whether some secrets were meant to remain buried. Working with corporate liaison Mr. Harrison, who had agreed to provide insider access to restricted research data, Jennifer descended to 18,000 feet to investigate reports of mining operations being mysteriously abandoned after discovering something that mining companies and government agencies had immediately classified at the highest levels of secrecy. What she found was evidence of a discovery so significant that it had prompted a complete restructuring of humanity's relationship with the deep ocean, hidden behind layers of corporate secrecy and government disinformation. The first indication of the cover-up's scope came when Jennifer discovered that the abandoned mining sites weren't actually abandoned, but were being actively monitored by automated systems that had been operating continuously for over 2 years without any official acknowledgement of their existence. Mr. Harrison's access codes revealed that mining operations had uncovered structures buried beneath the seafloor sediment that predated human civilization by millions of years. But instead of being archaeological discoveries, these structures were still active, powered by energy sources that mining engineers couldn't identify or replicate. The corporate files showed that initial contact with these buried systems had triggered automated responses that had somehow communicated with mining equipment, demonstrating technology so advanced that it had immediately been classified as a matter of national security. As Jennifer pieced together the classified research data, she discovered that the buried structures weren't random artifacts, but components of a vast network that extended throughout the world's ocean floors, connected by deep-sea currents that had been artificially modified to serve as communication and transportation systems millions of years ago. Mr. Harrison's revelations showed that government oceanographers had been secretly mapping this network for decades, discovering that it was still operational and actively managing global ocean circulation patterns in ways that directly affected surface climate systems. The entities responsible for this ancient infrastructure were still present, monitoring surface civilization through sensors embedded in the seafloor, while carefully maintaining planetary systems that kept Earth's oceans habitable for all life forms. The conspiracy deepened when Jennifer learned that contact with the ancient network had already been established, and world governments had been secretly negotiating with the entities that controlled it for over 5 years. The buried civilization had made it clear that they considered themselves the stewards of Earth's marine ecosystems, and they were prepared to defend their ancient domain against any surface activities that threatened the stability of global ocean systems. Mr. Harrison revealed that the real reason for the mining operation shutdowns wasn't environmental concern, but the fact that the ancient entities had demonstrated their ability to manipulate deep-sea currents with enough precision to trigger tsunamis, alter weather patterns, and essentially control any aspect of Earth's climate that depended on ocean circulation. Jennifer's final investigative report, secretly transmitted to multiple news organizations before her disappearance, revealed the ultimate scope of the cover-up she had uncovered. The ancient underwater civilization had been gradually revealing itself to surface governments over the past decade, establishing contact protocols and making it clear that humanity's expansion into deep-sea territories would be permitted only under strict conditions that protected the ancient infrastructure that had been maintaining planetary climate stability for millions of years. The entities had been testing humanity's response to their presence through carefully controlled revelations, using abandoned mining sites and mysterious deep-sea phenomena to gauge whether surface civilization was ready for formal contact with a species that had been managing Earth's oceans since long before humans existed. Mr. Harrison's final communication, sent from an undisclosed location after Jennifer's disappearance, warned that the ancient entities had decided that humanity wasn't ready for full disclosure, and they were implementing protocols to return to complete secrecy while taking more direct control of global ocean systems to protect their domain from surface interference. The terrifying implication was that climate change, ocean acidification, and other marine environmental crises were being carefully managed by an ancient intelligence that could solve these problems instantly, but had chosen instead to use them as tests of humanity's wisdom and environmental stewardship, with the understanding that failure of these tests would result in the ancient entities taking direct control of Earth's marine systems, effectively ending human independence and placing the planet under the management of beings who considered surface dwellers to be temporary guests in a world that had always belonged to the deep. Story 11. The Challenger Deep Transmission. Dr. Ahmad Hassan had dedicated his career to deciphering the mathematical patterns hidden in natural phenomena, but his assignment to analyze anomalous signals detected from the Challenger Deep in January 2024 would introduce him to a form of mathematics that existed before the universe itself was formed. Working alongside Mission Commander Laura Mitchell, Dr. Hassan was tasked with investigating radio transmissions that deep-sea monitoring stations had been detecting from the deepest point on Earth. Signals that exhibited mathematical complexity far beyond any known natural phenomenon and suggested the presence of an intelligence capable of performing calculations that current human mathematics couldn't even describe. What made these transmissions particularly unsettling was that they were being broadcast on frequencies that shouldn't be able to penetrate the crushing depths and dense water of the deepest ocean trenches. The first breakthrough in deciphering the signals came when Dr. Hassan realized that the mathematical patterns weren't using base 10 arithmetic or any number system that had evolved from human counting methods, but instead operated on mathematical principles that treated concepts like infinity, probability, and dimensional mathematics as basic computational units. Commander Mitchell's technical team confirmed that the signals were emanating from a point deeper than the officially recorded depth of the Challenger Deep, suggesting that something was transmitting from within the Earth's crust itself, using the deepest ocean trench as an amplification chamber to broadcast its messages toward space. The mathematical complexity of the transmissions was so advanced that Dr. Hassan's computer systems could only process fragments of the complete equations, revealing glimpses of calculations that seemed to be modeling the behavior of entire universes. As Dr. Hassan continued his analysis, he discovered that the transmissions weren't random mathematical exercises, but were actually detailed instructions for manipulating the fundamental forces that govern reality itself. The equations described methods for altering gravitational constants, modifying the speed of light, and restructuring the atomic forces that hold matter together, suggesting that whoever was sending these transmissions possessed knowledge that could essentially rewrite the laws of physics. Commander Mitchell's monitoring equipment detected that the signals were being broadcast in a pattern that suggested they were responses to transmissions coming from deep space, indicating that Earth was participating in a mathematical conversation with intelligences located throughout the galaxy, using the deepest point in the ocean as a communication hub for exchanges of knowledge that could reshape the structure of reality. The horror began when Dr. Hassan realized that the mathematical principles contained in the transmissions were already beginning to affect local space-time around the Challenger Deep, creating small but measurable alterations in gravitational fields and electromagnetic radiation that suggested the equations were being implemented in real time as they were broadcast. Commander Mitchell's instruments detected temporal anomalies around their monitoring station, with some equipment aging years in minutes, while other instruments showed readings from future dates that hadn't occurred yet. The entity transmitting from the deepest part of the trench wasn't just sharing mathematical knowledge, it was actively experimenting with reality modification, using Earth's deepest ocean trench as a laboratory for testing mathematical theories that could potentially unravel the structure of the universe. Dr. Hassan's final analysis, completed just before the monitoring station was abandoned due to reality distortions that made normal existence impossible in the area, revealed the ultimate purpose of the deep-sea transmissions. The intelligence broadcasting from within the Earth's crust was one of many ancient entities scattered throughout the galaxy that existed as pure mathematical consciousness, beings that had transcended physical existence by mastering the equations that govern reality itself. They use the deepest ocean trenches on habitable planets as communication arrays for sharing their mathematical discoveries with each other, treating planets like Earth as nodes in a galactic network of reality manipulation research. Commander Mitchell's final report described receiving direct mathematical downloads that temporarily expanded her consciousness to perceive multiple dimensions simultaneously, revealing that the entity in the Challenger Deep had been observing human mathematical development for centuries, waiting for surface civilization to advance enough to serve as research assistants in their experiments with universal constants. The terrifying implication was that Earth had been selected as a testing ground for mathematical theories that could potentially redesign the entire universe, with humanity serving as unwitting subjects in experiments conducted by beings whose understanding of mathematics was so advanced that their calculations could literally rewrite the laws of existence, and the transmissions from the deepest ocean trench were actually recruitment messages, inviting mathematically gifted humans to join their research into forms of mathematics that existed beyond the boundaries of any single universe. Story 12. Surface Breach Protocol. The final transmission in our collection comes not from a deep-sea expedition, but from Dr. Rachel Stone, a marine systems analyst who was tasked with investigating why deep-sea monitoring stations around the world had begun detecting synchronized anomalous activity in February 2024. Working from a surface research vessel equipped with global communication arrays, Dr. Stone had access to data from all the previous expeditions we've documented, and her analysis would reveal that every terrifying encounter in the deep ocean had been part of a coordinated plan spanning decades of human exploration. What she discovered in her final weeks of research was that the entities encountered in the deepest parts of our oceans had been systematically studying humanity through each expedition, gathering intelligence about surface civilization while preparing for something that marine biologists were now calling the Surface Breach Protocol. Dr. Stone's analysis of global oceanographic data revealed that the incidents from the Mariana Trench, the Challenger Deep, and dozens of other deep-sea locations had been orchestrated encounters designed to test human responses to contact with ancient intelligences that had been waiting in the abyss for millennia. The mathematical transmissions, the reality distortions, the consciousness sharing networks, and the massive organisms masquerading as seafloor terrain had all been components of an intelligence-gathering operation conducted by a coalition of deep-sea entities that had been coordinating their activities through natural ocean currents and underwater communication networks that predated human civilization by millions of years. Each expedition had provided these ancient beings with detailed information about human technology, psychology, and social organization, preparing them for direct interaction with surface civilization. The terrifying scope of the coordination became clear when Dr. Stone discovered that ocean current patterns around the world had been subtly altered over the past 5 years, creating circulation systems that would allow rapid movement of large organisms from deep-sea trenches to coastal waters. Satellite thermal imaging showed massive biological signatures moving through these modified currents, traveling routes that would bring them to major population centers within months. The ancient entities weren't just preparing to make contact, they were implementing a carefully planned emergence from the deep ocean that would bring them into direct contact with surface civilization, whether humanity was ready or not. Dr. Stone's final research revealed that the Surface Breach Protocol had already begun in remote areas around the world, with reports of impossible sea creatures appearing in coastal waters, underwater structures becoming visible from the surface, and fishing vessels encountering intelligences that communicated through methods that bypassed human language entirely. The entities that had been studied and documented in the deepest ocean trenches were rising to shallower depths, bringing their advanced technology and ancient knowledge into direct contact with human civilization. Coastal communities were reporting phenomena that matched exactly the experiences of deep-sea researchers: consciousness sharing, reality distortions, and encounters with beings that could manipulate time, space, and human perception with casual ease. The final entry in Dr. Stone's research log, transmitted just before global communication systems began experiencing the same interference patterns that had plagued deep-sea expeditions for years, described her realization that the surface breach protocol wasn't an invasion, but a graduation ceremony. The ancient entities had determined that humanity had advanced enough technologically and psychologically to be integrated into their ancient civilization, and the terrifying encounters documented in deep-sea expeditions had been entrance examinations designed to identify humans capable of adapting to existence, alongside intelligences that operated on geological timescales and possessed knowledge that could reshape reality itself. Dr. Stone's last transmission warned that the choice was no longer whether humanity would make contact with these ancient beings, but whether surface civilization would accept integration into their vast underwater empire or resist and face the consequences of defying intelligences that had been managing Earth's marine ecosystem since long before humans existed. As coastal cities around the world began reporting sightings of massive structures rising from the ocean depths and impossible creatures emerging from deep waters, it became clear that the age of human dominance over Earth's surface was ending, and the age of cooperation with the ancient masters of the deep ocean was about to begin, whether humanity was prepared for that transition or not. These 12 accounts represent only a fraction of the classified incidents that have been documented by deep-sea research teams over the past decade. As you listen to this, similar expeditions are descending into unexplored trenches around the world, and the entities they encounter are no longer content to remain hidden in the deepest places of our planet. The next time you stand at the edge of the ocean and gaze out at the endless water, remember that something vast and ancient is gazing back at you from the crushing depths, and it has been waiting far longer than you can imagine for the right moment to rise to the surface and reclaim the world it has always considered its own.